Have you ever wondered why you and so many other people in the world have so many fears and limitations that hold you back in life? Sometimes ones that you might even realize don't really make that much sense, but they still feel very real and scary and limiting. Well, in this video we are going to talk about how by diving into the depths of your past and then freeing yourself from it, you can transcend those limits and transform your life in a way that you would have otherwise never thought to be possible. Today we are going to be talking about the inner child. And just in case you have no idea what the inner child is, I do have a video on that right here, but just as a very brief recap, the inner child is essentially a way for us to think of subconscious patterns that have been kind of woven into our sense of self that are formed at a very early age. And this inner child, these subconscious belief patterns from our childhood that stay with us for decades, are formed as a result of very often exaggerated or misinterpreted situations that we go through in our childhood that we then identify with and take to mean something concrete about who we are and our role in the world. And this could be either negative or positive. This could be something that's very traumatic or something that's almost neutral, because when you are a little kid, we tend to be pretty egocentric for one thing, which means kids think everything is pretty much about them. You might have noticed this if you've hung out with any kids. It leads kids to internalize situations that might be neutral as being about them. So if their parents split up at an early age, kids don't understand and kids start to think, what did I do wrong? So how does this connect to your current adult limits that in life feel, of course, incredibly real and concrete and very overwhelming at times, right? How do those connect to things that happened decades and decades ago? Well, how it works is, as a kid, generally we develop our very first concepts of limitations, our very first thoughts of who we need to be in a given situation, or who we are, what our role is, what we're supposed to do, what we need to do to get our needs met. So this could be, like I said, your parents getting divorced. This could be the very first time your mom doesn't hug you the same as she always has, and you're 2 or 3 years old, and you think, because you're an egocentric little kid who is helpless in the world, all of your needs are met by this person, and if your mom gets home late from work one day and doesn't have the energy to engage with you with the full amount of love she's always given you, a little kid can still take that personally and say, well, Mom didn't react the way she normally does. What did I do wrong? What did I do? What do I need to do to fix this? Because they take things personally because they're trying to build their worldview. For an example of how these limitations can spring from what would be perceived as positive, non-traumatic experience as a little kid, I got a lot of praise when I was a little kid for, oh, Andrew's so smart, he knows all these things, and he knows all this stuff. When I was like 4, people were always amazed, or they acted amazed, I don't know, I was 4, about, oh, he knows the difference between nocturnal and diurnal, because I read a lot of those old zoo books, magazines. That seems at face value like they're just being a doting family. But somehow, in my child mind, that became a deep-seated need for me to always be smart. I learned, or so I thought at that point, that my value in the world, my importance, who I was to be the person who knew everything, who was smart, to always get that feedback. And then that became a crippling sense of perfectionism that led to fear of anything where I could be seen as not being perfect, not being smart, not being that, oh, golden boy, whatever, that came from a memory of me being like 4 years old. And this process ends up creating some of the very first limitations psychologically that we feel. The very first time that we feel that we are not enough, or that we are not good enough at this, or need to be better over here, or somebody might not like us for who we are as a little kid. We start to feel like for the very first time since we've been a baby, pretty much it's just been okay for us to be us. A baby just being doesn't really think, well, I'm not good enough. No, they're just being a baby. If they throw up on somebody, they don't think, oh my God, I just threw up on somebody. No, what are they gonna think? The baby doesn't care, right? The baby doesn't have that psychological process going on. But at a certain age, early in life, as kids start to learn and build their worldview, these limitations start to get integrated because they're observing all these situations and they're starting to try to build a sense of self. They can build in limitations like, well, mom doesn't like it when I do that. My parents are arguing, and if I don't make them happy and do my best to be all cute, then they're not giving me all the love they used to. So I need to be a people pleaser now. Or my parents are arguing all the time, and no matter what I do, they seem upset. So I can't seem to trust them. I gotta have to take care of myself. These are decisions that can be almost hardwired into our minds at under 5 years of age. Even if those aren't really realistic reactions, even if that's not actually the scenario going on, of course, these decisions are being made in the head of a little kid, right? That's why it's your inner child. It might not be rational, but it is understandable for the reaction of a scared little kid to be whatever self-preservation is, because these kids are, when you are in that situation, very dependent. And if you have a genuinely traumatic situation going on as a little kid, you have to figure out, what is my role in this situation? What do I need to do to survive? Because I need these people to take care of me. I'm gonna literally die if they don't. So I gotta figure out how to cope and navigate. On a subconscious level, we are learning that at the same time we are learning, like, cat says meow, dog says bark, Andrew says I need to people please in order to get my needs met because I'm inherently not worthy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's real, but it gets integrated into our worldview. And that is where the initial formation of these limitations begins. The observation that I need to be a certain way for these people to get my needs met. And that is the core of where these limitations that we feel begin. They start as the feeling as a little kid that I must not be good enough right now because mom and dad didn't love me like they used to, or I didn't get the attention like I used to, or they didn't laugh or smile like they did that last time. I must not be good enough anymore. What do I need to do to compensate for that? And that is where we get those core little kernels of, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I must not be lovable inherently anymore like I was when I was a little baby. Now I need to do something to be good enough for everybody else. Now, these beliefs are integrated at a very, very early age, right? So they become almost the foundation for our follow-up life experience. So what happens is, as we get older, new things that happen, new information gets filtered through the lens that we already have, that our role in the world is to be a certain way. We already think we need to people please, or we already think that people will hurt us if we let them get too close, because that is a building block of our sense of identity, because it was integrated, once again, at the same time as we're learning, like, what animals are, how the world works on a fundamental level. We're learning language. In many cases, these limitations are already at that point seated sort of in our sense of who we are and our role in the world. So for me, early in my childhood, I grew up feeling like my sense of value had to be proved. I felt an inherent lack of worth that could only be compensated for by achievement. My job was to be the smartest, to get the best grades, to always know everything, even to, this wasn't my job, but I did it, to put other people down so that I could feel superior, because my sense of self, my sense of my role was to provide value by being smart, by being witty, by knowing things. And that was who I was. But with that comes a tremendous amount of limitation, crippling fear about anything that I could be seen as less than perfect, crippling fear about relationships, about people leaving me, about anything that could dent that image I was trying to build to portray to everybody else, because I thought, this is who I have to be. I didn't even have enough frame of reference to think that I think this is how I have to be. No, just this is what is. This is who I am. This is what has to be, was my worldview. That's not real, but it stemmed from those childhood seeds that I then built up follow-up experiences on top of. We use that foundation of limitation, that foundation of I'm not good enough, and we start stacking up our extra pieces of who we think we are. We build our sense of identity on this shaky ground of limitation, and then as we go through our lives, our tower gets more and more wobbly, and things start to bother us more and more. And you might notice that in a lot of cases, the older people get, they seem to be more and more limited, not just physically, but mentally. They start to become more and more rigid. anything that bumps this huge tower of identity can become very scary because it's all built on this fragile ground, and people start to protect that to try to maintain how they think they are. So the seeds of these limitations that we feel as adults, these fears of relationships or commitment or not being enough for somebody or that nobody will ever love you, these fears of I am inherently unworthy and I need to do something to cope. When we trace them back, they have roots that go back down into these childhood experiences where we were trying to identify who we are and what our role in the world was. And we make decisions based on, admittedly, as in hindsight you can see, very limited information. It's possible our parents were just having a bad day, we took it personally and said, you know what, I can never trust again. As a little kid, you need to do whatever you can. Your mind's trying to keep you alive. The people who are in your direct environment are the reason you are alive. You can't take care of yourself, so you need to do whatever's possible to keep them happy. So we develop coping mechanisms, and those coping mechanisms are what we repeat over and over and over. But those coping mechanisms are very limiting, and once you are no longer a child, they are no longer necessary, if indeed they ever were. They are definitely no longer necessary once you are an adult, because they are born out of coping with a situation which is no longer your present reality. But if we don't question these beliefs, we just run on the assumption that they are correct. And that's why so many people have issues with feeling, and I've felt it myself, dramatic unworthiness, unlovableness. Why would anybody ever love me? I must be wrong. And from an early age I felt that, from like 12 maybe, from an early age, and I had a pretty good childhood. I'm not entirely sure when I internalized that belief, but once that belief is built into the foundation of our identity, it's almost too late until we are able to see the structure of the whole thing, because we can no longer question. It's just our reality seems to be that I am unworthy. Our reality is that I am not good enough. Because we are building that reality, everything has been built periodically stacked on top of that foundation that was formed in childhood. And you cannot build a life of freedom on a foundation of limitation and unworthiness. It's just impossible. What happens is what we see played out so much in the world, where people do one of two things. They either go through life trying to compensate for their feeling. If they're trying to build a life on this foundation of unworthiness, of limitation, what they do is they go through their life trying at all odds to push against their fear of being inadequate. They try to prove people wrong. They become overachievers. They do what I did. They become perfectionists. You know what? I feel like I'm unworthy, but I'm gonna prove them wrong. Really, I'm just trying to prove myself wrong by getting everything right, by doing everything perfect, by never making any mistake, then everybody will have to love me. If I get all the money, if I have all the women, if I have all the glitz and the glamour and the mansion, if I get all the fame, then I'll prove to myself that I'm enough. Or two, people just give up. They believe that they are not enough and they feel overwhelmed by the inability to cope with that reality because it is their perceived reality, because their entire life has been built on the foundation of these beliefs that are integrated into our personalities when we're very, very young. And questioning that is almost like questioning, does a dog say woof and a cat say meow? We learn it at like the same time. So it's fundamentally ingrained as this is just the way the world is. This is who you are. You're not good enough. When you look at that, when you actually go back, you can say, that's not right. Because at their core, so many of these limits that we feel, so many of these psychological kind of things that hold us back in our own head, the beliefs about our worthiness, or I can't do that, or I'm unlovable, or I need to make sure everybody likes me, or I'm gonna feel abandoned, or I can't trust people, I need to push them away because they're just gonna hurt me. All of these beliefs, all of these limitations are just our adaptation that our childhood self made a long time ago that we then stacked on future scenarios. So you might say, well, no, that didn't come from my childhood. Somebody abandoned me in middle school, or my girlfriend left me in high school, and that's what ruined me. But if you at that point had already had a foundation of worthiness, if in high school when your girlfriend leaves you or your boyfriend breaks up with you, if you already had that core belief, it really wouldn't hurt so much. It would still sting, most likely. It's still gonna be sad, that's normal, that's human. But it doesn't feel like the fundamental betrayal of worthiness. It doesn't feel like I'm abandoned, I'm going to die, which is what it does feel like if you have the unworthiness wound, if you have the core belief. If you're building your worldview on this ground of limitation, this ground of unworthiness, then it's going to feel like a complete world-shattering event. But it all comes down to that ground. It all comes down to questioning, is that basis for which I'm trying to build my identity, for which I'm trying to say this is who I am, is that true? Did I get something wrong way back in my childhood? And this is where the limitlessness comes in, because while you cannot build your limitless life, while you can't build a life of freedom on that ground of limitation, you can look at it and realize that what you had assumed you had to be, how you had assumed you have to be, the limits you have assumed do apply to you because you are the way you are, the way you think you are, who, in fact, you think you are, might not be real, per se. Because as long as I believed that story I told myself as a little kid, that my value comes from only my intelligence and my ability to get things right, and that means that if I ever get anything wrong or I'm seen to be less than perfect, I'm a failure. In fact, I'm then worthless because my worth only came from being perfect, right? As long as I believe that, I can't build anything significant. My entire life is fundamentally oriented around that core belief. It's going to change how I interact in jobs. It's going to change how I interact in relationships. It's going to change what I think I'm capable of doing. I'm not going to go approach that girl and ask for her number. She might reject me, and that would reflect to me that I am not perfect. I would be a failure. That would mean I'm worthless. I can't do anything unless I know I'm going to succeed, or at least I'm gonna have a great excuse for why I failed, and it's not gonna be my fault. That was not just an example, that was a lot of my life I just talked about. And the thing is that as we get older, these fears start to become bits of shameful information we don't want to admit. We don't want to say to people that I feel unworthy. We try to hide it, we try to compensate, we try to shove it away from view, and it becomes, somewhat fittingly with the whole inner child thing, a monster under our bed. Just like a little kid who thinks there's a monster under their bed, they're terrified, right? They're paralyzed by fear, and they can't do anything because they believe that there's a monster under their bed. Of course, as the adult, you know that the monster is not real. It's the exact same thing in a mental sense with these fears about unworthiness or fundamental unlovability, or just you're not good enough the way you are, or psychologically you are unworthy. There of course might be, like, you might not be strong enough to climb a mountain right now, but there's people who say, I could never do that. Listen for language. People say, oh, I wish I could do that. I could never do that. Oh, that would never be me. People say that kind of thing all of the time, and that reveals their fundamental beliefs of limitation about themselves. They have a fundamental switch somewhere in their mind that says, I could never do that. That is so far from being objectively true that anybody saying it, unless there's really, really significant physical evidence, should wake up and look around and say, why am I saying that I could never do something? What I'm actually saying is that on this whole foundation of I am fundamentally limited in some way, fundamentally I believe I am inadequate in some way, and I've built my entire identity. This me way up here on this tower that I've built on this shaky ground of limitation can't do it. That might be true, but only because it is predicated on the belief that is stacked up below it, all of the fundamental limitations that have happened up till then. Look inward, please. Really look inward to yourself. Don't just take my word for this. Look into your own life and ask, fundamentally, are the limitations I believe that I have that hold me back in life, that I could never do that? Oh, I'm just not a good person with money. I could never be that way. Or, oh, that kind of person would never be interested in me. I'm just not interesting. The fundamental psychological limitations we have, are those real? Or are they just the kind of flowering effect from those seeds that were planted in our minds literally decades and decades ago that we just haven't questioned, because we learned them at a very pivotal moment where we were learning language and what everything was, and we just kind of assumed that those are fundamental reality. The limitation that I am not good enough is fundamental reality, and that I have to build my sense of who I am on top of it. Really look at that and then ask yourself, is it possible that that child version of me misinterpreted the situation? That maybe the fact that mom and dad yelled at me that day was just because they were tired. Or really, maybe mom and dad were working through their own shit. Maybe it wasn't personal. Maybe, in fact, nothing that I've thought was personal and about me was really about me. Maybe that girlfriend who left me was just kind of working out her own inner patterns and her trauma and didn't really mean to break my heart. She was just doing what she thought was best for her. It's not really that personal. I don't really need to integrate that into who I think I am and build further limitations on top of the ones I thought I had already. So look, and really look, and I promise you, you will start to see that many of the limitations you think you have in life are illusory. They're not real. They're just kind of fragments of thought that are still running on autopilot, stuck years in the past, that do not benefit the way you currently are or who you could be. Find out who you could really be in the absence of who you think you have to be, in the absence of all of that limitation, in the absence of all of those chains that only exist in connection to who you thought you had to be when you were a little kid. You are no longer that little kid. You should no longer be afraid of the same things that the little kid was. But so many of us are, and I know in my life I experienced so much fear and anxiety. It should not be scary for me to go up and talk to somebody, to talk to a stranger. It should not be scary for me to try new things. It should not be scary for you to try new things or go ask somebody out or do any of these things that seem challenging, but really they are only challenging from the framework that this person is somehow judging my worth, or that somehow I need to prove myself, or somehow I need to make them happy, or that I can't trust people. It's based on the assumptions we made years and years and years ago. So dive in, find out the truth, and realize that you are not actually limited. The real you, the truth of your experience on Earth, is not bound by the psychological limitations of your childhood. You just need to see that whole process in effect, and in and of itself, that offers a tremendous amount of freedom. If you want to know a little bit more about how to free yourself, some more processes you might go through, I have a video about inner child healing right here, and if you want to know more about sort of the whole process of the inner child and how it forms, I have a whole kind of overview video right here. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.